I'm Catherine Morrison. I'm the Adult Services Manager here at the Scarborough Library. And on behalf of the staff and trustees of the library, I'd like to welcome you here today. March 15th, 2020 marks the 200th anniversary of Maine Statehood. This Bicentennial Series is being made possible through the financial partnership of the library, the Scarborough Historical Society, and through a grant awarded by the Maine Humanities Council. We're very thankful for our partners who have helped us put this series on. And today we're joined by the president of the Scarborough Historical Society, Rodney Lawton, and he's just going to make a few comments about the society.
Thank you, Catherine, and I'd like to echo her welcome. It's nice to see a full room here today. If you haven't visited Scarborough Historical Society, we have a museum on Route 1 in West Scarborough. It's tucked in behind the fire station across from Ace Hardware. We're open on Tuesday mornings from 9 to noon, and the first Saturday of each month also. Second Saturday of each month, also 9 to noon. Getting the peace sign first. Thank you. We have a museum store there, and Carleen has brought a few items from our museum store for you to take a look at, and we also have some complimentary copies of our most recent newsletter there as well. So thank you everyone for coming. I think that's all I had.
So I just want to point out our next two programs that are coming up. We encourage you to register at the end of the program today if you haven't done so already. The next program is going to be Mapping Maine with the Osher Map Library, featuring Professor Matthew Edney. And that date has been changed from March 15th to March 22nd. So hopefully everyone who had registered got that news, but we are taking registrations at the end of today's program. Our third program will be Dawnland, a documentary and discussion presented and facilitated by Maine Wabanaki Reach. That's going to be on Sunday, April 5th at 2 p.m. We'll also be displaying a bicentennial quilt, a beautiful quilt that's been put together by members of our community. That's going to be Friday, April 17th through Sunday, April 19th, and the quilt will be displayed on the Governor William King bed. There will be an opening reception on Friday, April 17th from 4:30 to 6:30. So we hope to see you then or over the weekend to come in and see the quilt. Today's first presentation is Past and Present, Perspectives on Maine Statehood, presented by Dr. Liam Riordan. Professor Riordan received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and is an early American historian specializing in the Revolutionary era. He's been on the faculty of the University of Maine since 1997. We're very honored that he's traveled down to Scarborough to be with us today. Please help me welcome him to the library.
So thank you all for coming out today. I really appreciate it. Nothing makes a speaker happier than a full room. So a treat for me. And I want to thank Celeste and Lucy and Catherine, who coordinated my visit, and also to the Historical Society for supporting this talk as well. So, a bicentennial, 200 years, a round number, we count by tens, but so the number itself is not really important, but it is a way that helps us to stop and pause and think a little bit about our relatively distant past. And maybe for people in this room, that's not just a once in a while thing. Obviously, we have a lot of devoted local history buffs here. But I tend to think that we don't reflect on our past all that much as a society. It seems to me we're in a moment where we're really focused on the present, maybe even mostly focused on the future. So it's really a pleasure for me as an early American historian who really has focused his professional life on the 18th century in particular to sort of have this moment of bicentennial reflection as an opportunity to think a little bit more about where Maine has come from. I do think that that act of historical commemoration is also something that puzzles us a little bit. I don't think we quite know what to do with a commemoration like this, and particularly something as somewhat abstract as the statehood process, right? It's not an event or an individual quite so much as the creation of a somewhat amorphous thing that people have all sorts of ambiguous relations to and thoughts of. And as I thought about trying to grapple with what was the statehood process and how should we commemorate it, I became aware of how the state centennial was celebrated in 1920. And 1920 was really, from a period of American history, that was the height of historical pageantry. In 1920, we rolled out the sort of red carpet all throughout the state to celebrate the centennial of Maine. Huge parades. It really clearly centered a lot of civic pride on the centennial. And this, of course, made me a little sad, right? That I wasn't a history professor in the era when history was much more central, I think, to our self-understanding, the way we thought about what we share and how we celebrate it. But in some other ways, our current situation in relationship to the past is, I think, more healthy. Because a lot of the 1920 centennial was explicitly racist and was also kind of fundamentally militarist. Big battleships in Casco Bay Harbor were part, somehow that was connected to the Maine Statehood process in the 1820s and became part of what was at the center of that celebration in 1920. So I'm at somewhat loose ends about this, right? I wish we had a clearer sense of how to commemorate and how to share our past, but I'm not completely upset in our more complicated relationship to the past today, because I think it represents a more accurate and a more meaningful reckoning with the past, which should not only be to celebrate, right? And I think part of the reason I say that is that if all we do when we look back at the past is celebrate and say everything was perfect and great then and we had great leaders, we really set ourselves up in a dangerous position for how we think about the present. Because we're all well aware of aspects of society today that we're not particularly proud of, that we'd like to see change, that we think could be improved. So if we always are thinking about the past as a golden era that was close to perfect, we sort of trap ourselves in our present in thinking about how do we move forward to the future. And in the end, that is what I think is really crucial about the public commemoration of history, that we're not only doing it to memorize facts about the past, we're also hoping to use that sense of the past to understand our current moment in a richer way, and hopefully that provides us with some resources for thinking about how would we like our society to change in the future. So my opening slide here has an image of what for a long time I thought was going to be really the only way in which Maine commemorated the bicentennial. Right? And this is the commemorative license plate that has been issued by the state. If you pay, I think, $40. You can take off your boring old front plate and put this on the front of your car. I think only until the end of the year. Then you're required to take it off. So I encourage you to get your state commemorative plate. The funds go to support the Bicentennial Commission, which is helping to coordinate commemorative events all across the state. So my plan, I'm going to set my timer because I'm a professor. I can talk and talk and talk, and I know I will wear out your stamina if I'm not careful. My strategy is to try to move relatively quickly through a description of the statehood era and what I see as some of these past-present connections. And hopefully that won't take much longer than a half an hour. That's why I've set my timer. And then I'd like to turn to questions and answers or discussion, and depending on your stamina, we can turn to some more images and more material, sort of things that I anticipate I'll get some questions about. So let's plunge in. What are the most basic facts of statehood? And I think by this point in our bicentennial year, we have actually seen quite a bit through news media and Maine Public Radio calling our attention to the bicentennial. So perhaps this is no big surprise, but the most basic facts of statehood is that Maine became the 23rd state in the US on March 15, 1820. And this is, I'm going to show two different maps today made by Moses Greenleaf, incredible surveyor and cartographer who lived in Maine in this era. And I like to think of this as the first official map of the state of Maine. I've been told that's not quite right. It's not really an official map, but I am pretty sure it's the first map made after statehood. And maybe you can't quite see, but at the bottom corner, Moses Greenleaf labels this a map of the state of Maine. And roughly speaking, that conforms to our sense of the boundaries of the state today. Now, one challenge, I think, with focusing so much on March 15th, 1820, I mean, it is nice. We have a very clear birthday, right? That is the official day that Maine became a state. But to only think about that endpoint is not really to understand something that was central to the statehood process that is a bit of a puzzle to us today. So Maine became a state over the course of several decades. And there actually are 6 state separation votes, popular votes in what was then the District of Maine in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I think this is confusing to us because almost everybody in Maine today understands that people in Maine have a certain animosity toward people from Massachusetts. And we're like, well, of course Maine's going to become independent. I mean, the second you had the possibility to vote on this, you would vote yes. We want to get rid of that connection. We're not even attached to them physically, right? It just doesn't seem logical, reasonable, natural. To us today, it's obvious that this is going to happen. So this is one of the problems of doing history. Because what is obvious to us today was not obvious to people then. That this was a difficult decision, one that had unforeseen consequences, and it took us a long, long time to get to this point of March 15th, 1820, when Maine does become a state. So I think an interesting way to begin to plunge into some of the complexity about this long statehood process is to take a closer look at some of the voting data that we have of those 6 statehood votes, right? They're often called a separation vote, because that was the question that was put before Maine voters. Are you in favor of separation, or are you opposed? So in these maps, I've got sort of county level data with purple showing support for separation and green showing opposition. So green represents the places on these maps where voters wanted to stay within Massachusetts. Now, there are a lot of things. I could talk about this set of maps for a long, long time, and if anyone else wants to go there, we can come back to this and dig into it. But I'll just make a couple of observations about what this sort of overview of the voting patterns suggests to us. And maybe the most important thing to note is that each of these maps does not become a little more purple, a little more purple, a little more purple, right? This is not a gradual or, again, natural movement towards separation. It's actually pretty up and down and back and forth, so that in 1807, that third vote, every single county in the state, except for Kennebec County, had a majority opposed to separation. So the separation movement is something that changes over time, right? And maybe the most boring part of this is that final vote in July 1819, right? When everybody agrees, there's nothing really interesting to talk about there. To me, it's those earlier votes where people are disagreeing and we're seeing a lot of volatility that are perhaps the most interesting. And maybe the last thing I'll say about this is just to point out one other kind of confusing thing here. There are 2 state independence votes in 1816. Right, now that seems like a little confusing, right? Why would that have happened? So, one thing, it is clear that the Maine independence movement gathers real steam as a result of the War of 1812, right? Parts of down East Maine are occupied by the British during the War of 1812, just as was the case as well during the Revolution. And Massachusetts state government, which was largely controlled by Federalists, while the presidential administration since the election of Jefferson in 1800 has been largely entirely controlled by Jeffersonian Republicans. And this put the state of Massachusetts at real odds with national leadership that had gone into this war against Britain. So Federalist opposition to the war in Massachusetts meant that the state government refused to allow the federal government to nationalize the state militia. Pretty amazing and controversial. I mean, something that we couldn't, I don't think, imagine today. I mean, think how difficult and conflicted that would be, right? A lot of angry politics shaped this era, and a lot of real division. So the War of 1812 happens. This is sort of giving a leg up to the pro-separation forces. And one last footnote, I'm trying not to go on too long, but one interesting thing, so Maine's population has been booming since the American Revolution, right? A huge migration, mostly of people from southern New England, moving into land that is not occupied by other English speakers, and those relatively poor, relatively young people are very strongly Jeffersonian Republican. By about 1806, there are clear Jeffersonian Republican majorities in the District of Maine, while there are clear Federalist majorities in the older part of Massachusetts. So there's a kind of interesting way in which partisanship and place work at cross purposes. By 1860, Federalists in Massachusetts would like to get rid of the District of Maine. Right? They will have a safer control of elections if they can jettison these Jeffersonian Republicans that dominate the District of Maine. And by contrast, Jeffersonian Republicans in the old part of Massachusetts are furious with their party colleagues that they're going to separate, because Jeffersonian Republicans in the old part of Massachusetts without the district are really going to be sunk. So they're actually not talking to each other. They're furious, right? So partisanship in place can really not line up very neatly. It can lead to some interesting antagonisms. So the election happens in May of 1816. It does have a strong majority in favor of separation. So at the state level in May 1816, 62% of statewide voters support independence. But the problem is there was a really low turnout. And it didn't quite seem clear whether or not, based on that low turnout, it would be appropriate for the district to separate and become an independent state. But the Federalists who control Massachusetts would like to get rid of the District of Maine by this point. So they say, well, here is what we'll do. We are going to have a second separation election just in a couple of months in September. And when you vote on that issue for the second time this year, you can also vote for delegates to the state constitutional convention, right? So we're moving forward on this process. We're going to confirm this is what you want and elect your delegates. Now, both sides really mobilize for the second election. Voter turnout goes way, way up, but the anti-separation vote grows much more dramatically than the pro-separation vote. And the statewide vote in September of 1816 fell just short of the minimum that had been set for Maine to establish statehood. So I think, again, this just reminds us of how difficult and fraught this question was of should Maine become independent. Even after the War of 1812, when it just seemed like there was one more obvious reason why Maine should want to become independent, when they really mobilize and people really turn out, they aren't quite able to accomplish. So I'm going to move on because I'm in danger of spending all my 30 minutes on just this slide. And I want to talk a little bit about a way in which this slide is quite misleading. So when we look at that, we see the familiar sort of state of Maine, but that is not where people voting on the separation question actually lived. So I want to show the second map by this map maker I love, Moses Greenleaf. And this map shows where English speakers in Maine lived. And Greenleaf adds here these three bands of color to indicate the changing places of settlement of English speakers over time. So the blue area represents where English speakers had settled by the time of the Revolution. That pink middle band is the expansion of settlement by the election of Jefferson in 1800. And the third band in yellow is where people had settled by the time of statehood in 1820. So really clustered along the coast, of course, a bigger push inland in the southern part of the state and the southwestern part of the state. And this is entirely where adult male English speakers voted on this question of separation. Now, Moses Greenleaf is really interesting to me for a variety of reasons, but he lived in a town then called Williamsburg, but that is quite close to Brownville Junction today. This is actually not too far from where I live in Bangor, and Williamsburg is at the very top of the yellow bump in the middle of this map, right below the compass rose that's sort of off the top of the screen. And I think that Moses Greenleaf was very conscious of this idea that where you lived in Maine really shaped your understanding of life. And I think that's part of what he wants to show us with this, saying, the spread of where people are living is changing over time, and that's going to really shape how you think about yourself, your relationship to Massachusetts, your relationship to this question, should the District of Maine separate and become independent? Now, this takes me to the first of 4 past-present connections that I'd like to talk about today. Right? And this, I think, to me, is what really is the value of historical commemoration. Understanding the statehood era, so from the 1790s through the 1820s, that there were elements of Maine society and culture then that we can still recognize as really significant in Maine society and culture in the 21st century. And I think recognizing that a lot of the things we confront in our daily life and perhaps think of as sort of overwhelming or not sure how to fix, or an example of why things are so terrible now, are also aspects of life in Maine that have been with us for a long, long time. And the first of these is the question, were there 2 Maines in the statehood era? Right, we're familiar with this today, right? That there's a sort of coastal and southern Maine that is quite different from northern, interior, down east Maine, and that's a economic, political, cultural sort of divide. And that has also been said of Maine in the statehood era, that coastal communities that were older were more connected to Massachusetts and did not want to separate, and that it was these newer internal areas of the state where these Jeffersonian Republicans are moving in such numbers that they're the ones that are really at the forefront of wanting Maine to become independent. So I went out and figured out, well, what was the local vote in Scarborough, right? How does focusing on what people did here help us to think about this question, right? And obviously, Scarborough, if it holds true to form, should be a very staunch place opposed to Maine independence, right? It's an old settlement, it's on the coast, it's tied to commerce. The presumption is it has a strong federalist and congregational tradition, all of which would lead it to want to stay within the state of Massachusetts. When we look at the local data in those 6 elections, it's kind of amazing how unified voters were at the local level in Scarborough. So in those first 3 elections, they are overwhelmingly opposed to statehood. Right? And particularly, remember 1807 was that low voting point for statewide. I mean, that's a unanimous vote, 125-0. I bet you couldn't think of an issue where you could get a unanimous vote in the town of Scarborough on any issue today. So it does raise the question, well, maybe this is fraudulent. Maybe there's some manipulation of the election. It's hard to believe that not a single person voted the other way, but there we have it. Now, what's interesting is that flips almost 100% in those final 3 elections. So that does not quite hold true to form. I mean, obviously we know in 1819 that there are strong majorities in every county to be independent by that year. But 254-24, this is way at the outer edge, way above the statewide norms in terms of commitment to being independent. So something has changed on the local level. This is the sort of thing we really need the Scarborough Historical Society to help us figure out. I cannot tell you what exactly is going on here. But one thing that does interest me at the local level is that religion had a significant place in the state independence movement. So Massachusetts, living with the legacy of its foundation as a Puritan colony, had a state-supported church into the 1830s. So everyone who paid taxes in Massachusetts, and of course this includes the District of Maine, part of your taxes went to support a congregational minister, even if you yourself were not congregational. Right? So the separation of church and state in the Constitution, that's about the national government. State governments and the federal system can do what they want, and Massachusetts is really extreme in this regard, right? It's a sort of a Puritan legacy, right? That congregational established church was a powerful tradition into the early 1830s. Kind of shocking, really out of step with what's going on in other places. Now, I was looking through a local history of Scarborough, written in the 19th century, and I learned there that Scarborough's Methodist congregation is founded in 1802. And so I wonder at the local level, and the historian from the 19th century points out that the congregational church really was faltering in the early 19th century, and by 1829, it actually closes. So I wonder if part of this dramatic shift has to do with a rise of Methodists at the local level who want to get out from the control of an established church in Massachusetts by becoming an independent state of Maine. That's just a speculative theory. We'd have to really dig more into local information, but it's an interesting one and a possibility. All right, of course, I'm doing terrible with my time management. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit and move on to, on this question of were there two Maines in the statehood era, I guess I'm going to say yes and no. And that's also what I would say about that question today. Very simplistic to paint all of our state into just two colors, right? Whether that's red and blue today, or whether that's pro or anti-separation in the statehood era, right? I think there's a lot more interesting cross-sectional things going on, and certainly for people who love local history, and this is really where our love of history is, right? No one's really in history, most people who are into history are into it from a genealogical perspective, from their town perspective, right? We're not really into it so much from the state perspective, and it's at that level that we see much more interesting patterns and complexity and really get into the reality of everyday life and not the abstractions that are just to think about two Maines as being able to explain very much that's meaningful, either in the statehood era or today. Now, the second past-present connection I want to turn to really touches on the most famous aspect of the Maine statehood movement, right? The one thing that just about every school kid is taught, maybe they quickly forget it, is that Maine became a state in a controversial fashion because of how it was connected to slavery. Now this is a puzzle, right? Because we know today, just like in the statehood era, there are very few people of African descent who lived in the District of Maine then, just as now. So how could Maine statehood be part of this incredible crisis that really is the first time that slavery has forced the gears of national politics to come to a standstill? Right? So there was some discussion of slavery during the constitutional meetings in Philadelphia in the 1780s, but it's very quickly buried as the politicians there said, look, we're not going to touch that issue. It's a little unclear whether or not the ideas of the revolution are consistent with slavery, but we're going to make some practical decisions about commitment to the Union, and we're going to bury that issue. Well, when Missouri applied to be a state out of the territory that had been the Louisiana Territory, this happens about a year before Maine applies to be a state. And the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives, passed a bill and said Missouri cannot become a state if slavery is a legal institution there. Right? It is against the values of our nation. We will not permit that to happen. Now, the U.S. Senate disagreed with that and refused to support that bill that had passed in the House of Representatives. So this led to really a year-long deadlock in Washington, D.C. Then as now, intense disagreement, intense polarization, no interest in figuring out a way to resolve it. We just both sides dug in their heels, and we're not going to move. So move the calendar ahead 10 or 11 months. Maine has applied to become a state, right? After our long process, all those votes, we finally get a big unanimous vote, well, close to unanimous vote in 1819. We send our petition in to become a state, and now we get caught in this national crisis over slavery. So I do really want to come back and talk more about the Maine-Missouri crisis later, but I'm going to kind of push ahead and try to finish my other two connections and then ask for questions and comments. I'll just say one last thing about, this is kind of the classic textbook map of what is labeled here the Missouri Compromise. And I think there are two big problems with the way in which this most famous aspect of Maine statehood is identified here. Now, the first was pointed out to me in one of the very first one of these Maine statehood talks I gave, and a woman raised her hand and she said, when I was raised, we called it the Maine-Missouri Compromise, right? She was mad that it just is called the Missouri Compromise, right? She wanted Maine included there. So I think that's true, it's funny. But the other thing I learned is that compromise is actually a politically loaded label to give the resolution of this crisis. And I'll leave that as a teaser. I'll try to come back to that in the question period, and I'll explain why I no longer call it the Missouri Compromise. I now call it the Maine-Missouri Crisis. All right. So the third of my four connections is that I think it's really important that we think a bit about the international border. Right? Remember the contrast between those two maps made by Moses Greenleaf that I showed earlier, right? One kind of projecting Maine all the way to what we think of as a national border with Canada today, and the other actually showing us where Maine residents lived, at least the English-speaking voting public, all in the south, just along the coast. And the northern border of the state of Maine, the District of Maine, the United States, is a complete and utter mess, right? It will not get resolved, even in a formal, technical way, until 1842, right? We wouldn't, how could this happen, right, in our era of GIS and knowledge of space, right? That Maine could have been a state for more than 2 decades, even while no one is really sure where the boundary is for the state of Maine. So, and a lot of these problems go back to the American Revolution. This is amazing map, 18th century map, that was used by the people who negotiated the end of the American Revolution with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And all these different crazy lines on the map reflect the different arguments about where those diplomats thought the boundary would be between the United States and the ongoing British colonies that would become Canada a little bit later. Now, maybe the last thing I'll say about this map is to also kind of move us away from the big picture abstractions here to also say something about, well, who were the people that were living in that space that would eventually be decided was the dividing line? So the dividing line that's resolved in 1842 is the St. John River. And there were French-speaking colonists on both banks of the St. John River in considerable numbers beginning in the 1780s. And in fact, I looked at the 1820 census, try to get a sense of, what does Maine look like in 1820. Penobscot County had just been created in 1818, and they do the census in 1820. It's whatever, just like we think a census, categories of age range and so forth. And the three largest cities in Penobscot County in 1820 were Hamden first, Bangor second, and Madawaska third. And there's an asterisk in the printed census next to Madawaska, and you go down to the bottom and you look, and it says, the French-speaking people in Madawaska think they live in Canada. And in fact, you can't get there from the United States. To get there, you have to, he doesn't quite, and it's not a direct quote, but he says, to get to this community, you have to go to St. John, New Brunswick, and go up the river to get to Madawaska, where he found this community of 1,200 and some people, a large community by Penobscot County standards in that day. And the census taker went on to say, when the county line is eventually drawn, I suspect that one bank will be in Penobscot County and the other bank will be in Washington County. Now, the 1820 census taker was a US nationalist, right? He's pushing that border quite a bit further east than the final negotiations in 1842 would commit to, because when the border was made, it ends up dividing French speakers in the St. John Valley, right? The river that had connected them to kin and friends and business connections upriver, downriver, across river, were now told they lived in two separate states. So I gave a version of this talk in Madawaska a while ago, and I had a really interesting experience in a whole lot of ways, learned a lot about a very different perspective on how they understood their relationship to the state of Maine. And this, the sense of pain and division with the drawing of that international borderline, and of course it's become more intense in the wake of 9/11, right? For before that, movement was pretty easy back and forth, and much less so since then. So that really lingers. And something that a couple of people said this to me, they thanked me profusely for coming to Madawaska to give the talk. And they said, we really appreciate that you came all the way from Bangor in southern Maine. Well, people in Bangor do not think they live in southern Maine. But that again is an indication that the two Maines argument means a lot of different things. It's not one thing. The other thing that, again, this is just a regular line there, they said, thanks so much for coming from southern Maine. We know it's uphill all the way to get to Madawaska, which is why people from southern Maine never come here, and it's so easy for us because we can drive downhill all the way. So, right? A little sense of not being included, not being part of a state discourse, partly geographic, partly religious, partly ethnic, partly linguistic, right? We're a more complicated and ultimately more interesting place than just thinking about the state as two Maines. All right, the last of my four connections, and where am I on my time? Already over time. But there is one last really important past-present connection that is really crucial to think about a little bit. And that is to ask, what did Maine statehood mean for Wabanaki sovereignty? Right? If we're creating a new state, a new sovereign entity with governmental authority and power, what does this mean for Wabanaki people and nations who, by the early 19th century, have had treaty relations with Massachusetts going back their own nearly 200 years? And there's no question that Maine statehood brought real perils to Wabanaki people, right? That same flooding migration from southern New England into Maine, that's really the engine for statehood and a very dynamic Maine economy through the first half, 2/3 of the 19th century, is also an engine of dispossession for Wabanaki people, right? That their sovereignty, their homeland is challenged by an intensification of colonization that Maine statehood in 1820 marks in a very profound way. Now, I think that it's really crucial that we recognize this acceleration of dispossession. Those perils are very serious, and in a lot of ways the 19th century will represent a low moment in Wabanaki history. But I don't think it's enough to only focus on the perils and the tragedy of Wabanaki history in the statehood era, because there also is a really remarkable story of Wabanaki persistence in the face of those very grave challenges. So one of these is, I think, quite an extraordinary thing, but I believe that the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy are the only two indigenous nations in the United States east of the Mississippi that have had a continuous and unbroken, legally recognized claim to a portion of their pre-colonial homeland. Now, there's no question that homeland has shrunk dramatically, but still, that is a remarkable fact in the face of what we know to be the colonial history of the United States, and particularly that part of the United States that's east of the Mississippi River. And this persistence is not just sort of a long demographic thing that's, the Indian population in the United States has been growing every decade of the 20th century, so this is not just an issue in the past, it's also an important issue for our future. But that persistence was recognized at the time in a really interesting way. So in 1823, there was a Penobscot delegate to the Maine legislature. Now, that person was a non-voting delegate, so I'm not talking about, some kind of Garden of Eden world where they have full representation. But still, that idea that there was some official recognition that there was a indigenous presence within the state of Maine that needed to have, or that should have, some kind of position and observing role in the state legislature is, again, I think, without precedent in U.S. history. And the Passamaquoddy would add a seat 10 or 15 years later, and we would actually get Maliseet and Micmac seats there in the 20th century. So both perils and persistence, a real tension, but an ongoing part of Maine history into the 21st century that is connected to Maine in the statehood era as well. All right, so I'm going to take a little break. I'd love to get some questions, some comments, things that you'd like to dig more into, and maybe we'll just have a conversation for our last 20 or 30 minutes, or else, I'll threaten you with just more lecture and you'll never be able to do this. Yeah.
Back to the Missouri Compromise, who were the national level leaders that brokered that agreement, and how did it diminish from a Maine-Missouri Compromise to the current day?
So the sort of key person who's sort of making the sausage, as it were, is Henry Clay. And he's the Speaker of the House. He's from Kentucky. Very similar situation to Missouri, which is just to the west of Kentucky, also a slave state. And Clay, of course, will have a long career as a deal maker in Congress and then the Senate. So he puts together this package that's actually several different bills that are each voted on separately, but everyone understands they're going to come together, and that's what will end up resolving the issue and bringing in the two states, one slave and one free. The part I find most fascinating about the Maine-Missouri crisis is the way in which it was addressed by political leaders in the District of Maine. So in 1820, the District of Maine, still part of Massachusetts, and the District of Maine had 7 U.S. congressmen. That's kind of mind-blowing, given that we barely have 2, may not have 2 after the next census, who knows. And these 7 congressmen had a real division over the question of what to do with this controversy. So, they realized right away that this is a hot potato. And 2 of them in particular are writing back to William King, who is, of course, native son of Scarborough, and will be the first governor of the state of Maine, and is the sort of key leader of the Jeffersonian Republican Party in the state of Maine. He had been a Federalist earlier in his life, but he saw the writing on the wall. You're going to get nowhere as a Federalist in Maine. He switched parties. And the 2 sort of most ardent Jeffersonian Republicans in the U.S. Congress from Maine write back to him in Bath, where of course he's a very successful merchant, and they say, "You cannot believe how our petition has blown up. And we have got to be silent on the slavery issue." And the other of these 2 writes to him and says, "Look, we are going to need Southern allies to pass legislation," right? They're Jeffersonian Republicans. The heart of the party is in Virginia, so they kind of know where their bread is buttered on the situation. Now, what's interesting or complicating, is that William King's half-brother, Rufus King, also a proud native son of Scarborough, is at this point a leading anti-slavery member of the U.S. Senate from New York. And it does seem that initially William King is kind of leaning the way of his brother and is thinking, well, Maine shouldn't become a state if it's part of this ugly connection to slavery. We had no interest in slavery in Maine. But pretty quickly, William King folds and follows the advice of these other 2 ardent Jeffersonian Republican congressmen from Maine in D.C. So there's a 7-person delegation from Maine, and these compromise compromise packages go before the Congress, and the pro-slavery resolution passes in the U.S. House of Representatives by 3 votes. It's almost entirely a north-south split. There are only a small handful of northern members of the House of Representatives, people who are from non-slave states, who vote in favor of this, and 2 of them are from Maine. So 5 U.S. congressmen from Maine vote against Maine becoming a state because they reject this connection to slavery expanding into the West and into Missouri as part of this brokered deal. Now, then as now, when politicians don't want to take tough stands, if they can, they will avoid it and put it off. But here they were forced to take a stand on a really divisive issue. And part of that, then as now, meant they had to explain to their constituents why they took the stand that they did. So we've got newspaper letters from both sides explaining their position. And 4 of the 5 who voted against slavery and against Maine statehood through that mechanism wrote a joint letter that is really very eloquent about their fear of slave power, by their sense that slavery was morally wrong and was such a grave injustice that they could not support it. And this is really the letter that changed my sense of what I should call this event in my classes, because they went out of their way in the letter to say, we abhor the word compromise. This was not a compromise. This was forced upon us against our will, and we reject a label that would suggest this was something that was amicably worked out, that this was forced on us, and we really are disgusted by it. Very briefly, one of those letters explaining to the public this, why did I vote in favor of slavery, talks about the importance of popular sovereignty, that people, white men in Missouri should be able to decide whether slavery would be legal or not. It shouldn't be the distant national government telling them what they can or can't do. And part of what's interesting, this is John Holmes, who was he wasn't from, but he represented the district of Alfred, Maine at the time. And as an aspiring Jeffersonian Republican politician, he sent a copy of his public letter to Thomas Jefferson, who's still alive into the 1820s. And it's the response that Jefferson writes to John Holmes from Maine that gives us some of our most famous language about the Maine-Missouri crisis. Jefferson wrote, "It awoke me like a fire bell in the night." He saw this as a portent of the coming destruction over the issue of slavery. What's interesting in Jefferson's letter, and Jefferson's totally sympathetic with Holmes, they are on board about how to think about this issue. The thing that appalled Jefferson was not that slavery would be legal in Missouri. The thing that appalled him was the line, that was another part of the compromise, this red line on the map, that 3630 line. And that, as part of this complicated brokered resolution of the crisis, said that no other part of the Louisiana Purchase north of that line could have slavery as legal. That Missouri was going to be the exception, slavery could be decided there, but in the future, northern states coming in from that territory could not have slavery. And that was what upset Jefferson, that there was that prohibition put on the spread of slavery sometime into the future. Thanks for your question. Yeah.
What was the reaction of people in Massachusetts of losing this large territory?
So I do think that they were happy to get rid of us. Kind of for that partisan reason I said before, that sort of federalist control of Massachusetts will be more secure. So there are Jeffersonian Republicans in Massachusetts, particularly in rural western Massachusetts. And they were upset. They saw a real loss because they were going to be even a much smaller majority in Massachusetts politics without the strength of a Democratic Republican majority here. But I think, the issue had been talked about for such a long time, and I think a lot of people did recognize that Massachusetts and Maine were quite different. It did make some sense to separate them. So, yeah.
I've read that the physical distance and difficulties of communication between Boston and Maine was a major cause of the agitation for separation. For example, in 1810 or so, the stagecoach ride from Portland to Boston was 2 days with a sleepover in Portsmouth. The distance by sailing ship was about the same if the wind and the tides were right, and could be even longer if they weren't. And of course, there was no telegraph or internet or anything like that. Was that part of the debate, that the physical separation was so great and difficulties of transportation?
Yes, there's no question. And it was the issue was particularly raised about the cost of sending a local representative to the state legislature. If you had to go all the way from, particularly from an interior settlement, to the cost to send, and basically you've still got a very strong town government system, so you're sending representatives from towns. That would destroy the town budget. So a lot of towns don't bother to send a representative to the Massachusetts legislature. So this is a powerful argument in favor of Maine statehood, right? We'll have a capital that's closer, it'll be less expensive to send someone there, we can run Maine state government with lower taxes than what it will cost if we have Massachusetts representatives. People in Massachusetts don't really understand the local circumstances of people here. Again, we'll have more just, more appropriate laws if we're separate. One thing I think this is really a fascinating question. Because in this era, the fast way to move, and certainly the only way to transport bulky agricultural goods or timber, is by sea. Right? It's all coastal, and that's why Maine gets settled the way it does. And when you move beyond the Penobscot River, even as late as 1820, there is not a road to get to Portland, much less to Boston. And so this is, I think, part of why Hancock County and Washington County are some of the staunchest opponents of Maine statehood. Now, the population there is small. Again, these county level maps are a little distorting, right? Even though it's a big territory, there aren't that many voters there, but they're all along the coast when you get down east. And so from there, it was easier to get to Boston by sea than it would be to get by land to whatever would be a capital within Maine. So I think people down east were more suspicious of, well, who are going to be the state political leaders if we become independent? We'd rather keep dealing with the system we got, which at least we understand, and maybe that's a countervailing weight to, these wealthy people in Portland who also have a big population who are likely to dominate what would be an independent politics, whereas those Portland people have to play second fiddle if we stay within Massachusetts. So it's a great question. Whole different infrastructure of transportation, communication, and it's all about sea travel for anything that would happen quickly.
How were the indigenous people treated once we got statehood? Early 1800s?
Not well. It's this fascinating issue that is in the news literally this week, that Massachusetts had signed multiple treaties with the Penobscot and some treaties with the Passamaquoddy right up to 1820. I think there's an 1818 treaty between the Penobscot and Massachusetts. And this actually becomes a problematic issue in the very final stages of Maine statehood. You know, you finally have resolved the Maine-Missouri crisis, you finally got these votes, you think the whole thing is done, but those treaties that Massachusetts had signed had made some financial commitments to the Penobscot in particular. Well, did Maine, were they obligated to live up to the financial commitments that had been made by the state of Massachusetts? What if Maine just refused to pay it? And so to sweeten the deal at the last second, the Massachusetts government gives the Maine government a portion of money that will be used for those expenses created in those treaties in that earlier period. And I think, I don't quite know this for certain, I think this has to do with why there was that Penobscot delegate to the Maine legislature, right? That somehow there's this money that's being transferred, the legislature is going to control it, surely there should be some kind of loose oversight there.
Were they allowed to vote?
No, absolutely not. Just an observation. Yes?
I'd just like to mention that in the collections of the Scarborough Historical Society, we have a letter, yellow with age, dated 1819, from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, requesting, it's actually not requesting, but demanding that the town have an election to decide on whether we wanted to be in favor of separation. And I looked at it for a while, but I believe that there were definite restrictions on voting in those times. It had to be male, obviously was, you had to be a certain age, and you had to own property.
That's right. That's right. There is, I'll use that as an opening just to say something very briefly about the Maine State Constitution, which is quite interesting in this period. They use the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 as their model. They make a couple of really interesting changes. One of them is to get rid of a property requirement for voting. And that's sort of happening all over the US in this era, gradually, you know, sort of universal white male franchise is seen as the norm. But Massachusetts is one of the last places to give it up. And Massachusetts will actually have their own state constitutional convention, I think in 1821, where they get rid of the property requirement to vote, but it's really controversial. People argue it on both sides really intensely. When it was discussed in Maine, everybody supported that idea, right? It was a more populist, a more Jeffersonian Republican place, did not have that hierarchical commitment that property rights and voting included. The other thing, one other thing that's really interesting about the Maine State Constitution was this question of religious freedom. And as I suggested earlier, Methodists and Baptists in particular had real interest in separating from Massachusetts to get away from that established congregational church. So this comes up in the Constitutional Convention, it gets debated, and one of the delegates says, it does not matter if you are a Hindu or a Muslim, you will be able to have voting rights in the state of Maine. That's pretty amazing, right? Now he's speaking hyperbolically. There were no Hindus or Muslims, I think, in the state of Maine at that point. But there's really, you know, taking an idealistic stand about what is the principle of religious freedom. The final thing that's interesting in regard to how the voting rights are changing here is that another delegate asked the question, well, if we're going to allow any adult-free man to vote, what about free blacks? Could a free black man vote in the new state of Maine? And the delegates are really good on this. They decide absolutely that free black men should have the right to vote. And what's interesting about that is that this is not in step with what is happening in American political culture throughout the nation in this era, right? No question that no property requirement for white men, everybody's moving that direction. No question that there should be broad religious toleration and no state favoring of any particular denomination. But in this era, the 1820s, 1830s, revolutionary era state constitutions are getting revised to take the vote away from free black men. So Maine can take some satisfaction in that particular corner, that we were bucking the trend of where most states were going in this era. And to just point out that we have connections to the distant past, but we also have real differences. And that to me is what is interesting in understanding and thinking about the past, right? What remains similar? What are sort of the human dimensions of people then and now that remains relatively constant? But there also are profound changes over time. And that was also a very different place, even though we've got all sorts of connections with it to today. Thank you all for coming out.